Welcome back to Faith Formation at Home. In this week's Gospel, we continue reading Jesus' parables in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, you've heard parables before, but maybe it didn't occur to you. Parable is really just a story that illustrates a point. Most of the time, Jesus invented them completely out of thin air. Sometimes he used stories that people knew, and he kind of changed them a little bit to serve his purposes. And sometimes his parables were directly provocative. And this week's is one of those, right? This parable of the landowner, or parable of the vineyard, right? This guy sets up a vineyard, he puts a hedge around it, and he goes away and he puts people in charge of it, and then he sends messengers back, and the people working the vineyard won't listen to his messengers. And he keeps sending more, and they keep harassing them. Eventually he sends his own son, and they kill the son, right? And Jesus' point here is he's telling some of his listeners, you guys who aren't getting on board with what I'm saying, I know what you're thinking. I know where this is heading. You're the ones in the story who are going to kill the son. And he's trying to convince them to change their ways, right? But it's an interesting question for us in this parable. How do you know when a messenger is from God or not? How do you know if you hear something in prayer or you feel something? What if you get a dream? How do you know it's from God? How do you know it's not from God? If you have a friend who claims to be a prophet and to speak for God, because they're out there, how do you know what they're saying is actually from God and not just some made-up junk? Because that's the real question for these guys who are working in this vineyard. Right? A beginning way we can answer that question, how do you discern whether something comes from God or not, is does it sound like what God has said to us before? Does it sound like the Bible and the Gospels? Does it sound like church teaching, or does it just fly in the face of all that? If it flies in the face of what God has already said, then it's not from God. But if it can harmonize with what God has said and it sounds like the voice of God, then maybe it actually is from God. So our Bible story this week for our littlest ones comes from the Jesus Bible Storybook. It's God to the Rescue. Again, we're skipping over some of these stories so that we can get to Jesus by Christmas. So we're skipping over some great stories in the Old Testament. Feel free to read those with your kids. But this is picking up the story of Moses. By this time, God's people are slaves in Egypt, and God is sending Moses to lead them out of slavery. And it starts with this cool story of the burning bush. God's speaking to Moses out of a burning bush. And then Moses goes to Pharaoh and delivers these 10 plagues. Now, if you're like me growing up, I always saw these 10 plagues as like God just woke up on the wrong side of the bed and the poor Egyptians were on the wrong side of this thing. But when you dig into it, really, and you're probably not going to explain this to your littlest ones, but when you dig into it, what God's doing with these 10 plagues is that's a systematic slaughter of the Egyptian pantheon. Right? The Egyptians worshipped the Nile River. They thought it was a god. So when God turns the Nile River into blood, it looks like their Nile god has died. And every one of the 10 plagues is tied with at least one, sometimes multiple Egyptian gods, where God is showing the Egyptians, your gods are either dead or they're just useless. Either way, they're not real gods, right? And so he leads his people out of slavery in Egypt. And the end of this story points ahead to Jesus, right? It says someday God is going to do this again. He's going to lead his people out of slavery forever. He's going to free us from our slavery to sin and make it possible for us to get to heaven for eternity. We haven't gotten to the Red Sea yet this week. That's going to be our story next week. And so our catechism theme for our elementary grade students this week is who is God? Right? We're at the beginning we finished the first section in this book. Right now we're at the beginning of the Creed, 12 facts about God, which is really what the Creed is. It's a summary of the entire faith. Right? You could tie in just about every doctrine and dogma of the faith to some article of the Creed. And some of these questions that you're going to read through this week, you're going to read through the entire Creed, right? Because that's going to be the introduction to the next several weeks of our catechism themes. But then you're going to read some big, heavy questions and talk about those, right? Who is God? It's a big question, right? What can God do? How powerful is he? How did the world come into being? How is man different from all the other creatures that God made? And why did God make me? Right? All those are awesome questions. You might think these are too big for your kids, but I would encourage you to talk about those, especially that question, who is God? Because this is a basic truth of life. The way you think about God will color the way that we relate to him. What I mean by that is this. If we think that God is just a lawgiver who's sitting on a cloud with a lightning bolt waiting to blast us into hell for eternity because you ate a cheeseburger on a Friday in Lent, right? You're going to try to keep him at arm's length, right? And the idea of spending heaven for eternity with this being, you kind of approach it as, well, I want to get into heaven by the skin of my teeth, and I'll just try to avoid God for eternity, right? Because hell sounds like a bad option. I'd rather go to heaven, but I don't want anything to do with that being. Sometimes we see Jesus as like the proto-hippie, because that's how he's depicted in so many movies, right? With the bleach blonde hair and the Miss America beauty pageant sash. If you think Jesus is a hippie, you're probably going to approach religion and a relationship with him as that's cute, that's quaint, it's a little out of date. I'm not super interested in that. but I'll sort of loosely go along with it. I'm not really into that guy, though. But if you see God as this all-powerful, perfect, loving being who created you and me with a purpose because he loves us and he wants a relationship with us, that's a whole different way of relating to God. I can relate to that God a lot differently than I can relate to God the police officer or Jesus the hippie. So spend some time with that question, especially the adults in your household. Who is God? What do you think of when you think of God?